In this video, we take a look at interior lighting in Redshift, and I'm going to keep it as simple as possible. You can use a combination of a white dome light and an infinite light for interior lighting in Redshift for Cinema 4D. I have applied this light gray diffuse material with the RGB value of around 180 to all the objects in the scene. And let's start by adding a simple dome light to the scene and start IPR. Obviously, the scene is too dark and your first inclination might be to increase the intensity of the dome light. But when working with interior lighting in Redshift, I personally tend to keep the dome light at its default exposure or adjust it by a stop or two. In this case, if we wanted to solely increase the exposure value of the dome light to compensate our dark render, we would need to increase it by 6-7 stops, which makes me uncomfortable a bit, and that simply means the better way is to make sure our lens is properly exposed. On the other hand, Redshift Portal Light, which we'll talk about it in a moment, is a bit finicky, and in my own experience, the best way is just to keep the dome light at 1 or at its default intensity if the lighting will involve Portal Light at some point. And that's what you would do in a real world scenario, right? If you are taking a photo of an interior, you definitely make sure your lens is better exposed compared to an exterior shot. So that's why I think adjusting the camera exposure would be a better strategy. So let's open up our render view display settings, enable photographic exposure, and let's decrease the shutter time ratio to 4. So the lens will be exposed longer and therefore we will get a brighter render. This gives us a nice overall soft lighting to work with, and if you check the alpha channel, it won't affect the alpha, so you can take your render to Photoshop, After Effects, Fusion, Nuke, or any other post-processing app and simply place your desired background picture behind the windows. Now, it's a good time to talk about Portal Light and what it does. If I just start a final render in the render view, by default, we get a noisy render, which is not like Redshift. In newer versions of Redshift, you normally start a render and expect a fairly clean render, but this render is the opposite of that. Now let's save this image to the picture viewer by clicking on this PV button in the render view. Now, the reason for this noisy render is that huge spherical dome light encompassing the entire scene, and Redshift tries to compute the sampling for that whole sphere around the scene. And this small portion of the dome light that we see through the windows where the light rays enter the room would get a tiny percentage of that sampling from the entire dome light. So we get a noisy render. Using a portal light, we can guide the sampling process for the dome light and tell Redshift, hey, this is where we want to focus your calculation and sampling on. And to do that, you put a portal light or portal lights behind your window or windows, and they tell the dome light to focus its sampling through them and into the interior scene. Render engines are starting to get more intelligent, and some of them have already ditched portal lights and do that on their own. You just need your dome light and the render will take care of the rest. Hopefully Redshift follows suit soon. Let me stop IPR and add a portal light and place it right behind the windows, covering them completely. Just make sure to orient the portal light in a way that its z-axis looks inside, or you might not get a proper render. Now that we have our portal light properly in place, we can start another final render and see if it has improved our render or not. The render is finished and we can clearly notice the render is cleaner, and if we save it to the picture viewer and compare it with our previous render, you see with the same render time we have a much cleaner render. So the same render time but cleaner results thanks to the portal light. Now we can add an infinite light to represent our sun, so let's add one to the scene. Now we can rotate the infinite light and decide on how we'd like the light to shine through while the IPR is running. In this case, let me set the heading of the light to around 45 degrees and its pitch to around negative 18 degrees. Now, right now, the sunlight does not impose its presence. It's a bit too weak, so let's increase its exposure by 1 or 2 stops for now. To get a bit more realistic shadows, go to the Details tab and increase the shadow softness to around 0.5. So we get a bit softer shadows. And finally, to get a tad warmer colors from the sun, we can change the color mode to temperature and use something warm like 4500 Kelvin degrees. You can use warmer tones or cooler tones depending on your scene and taste. Now let's stop IPR and take a quick final render to see where we are. The render is done, and Redshift might not have all the features that some other renderers have, but it's freaking fast. This render took like 12 seconds. And while we are here, let's get rid of this high frequency noise. I'm gonna press Ctrl B to open up the render settings. Change the quality to high. Enable denoising. And let's use Alt single again as we want to denoise a final render. And let's start a final render right in the render view. This render took 40 seconds, which is really fast for a clean interior render. And now we get this noise-free, ready to go render. It might be a bit too flat, but you can make it a bit more contrasty right here in the render view. Let's open up our display settings again and go to the color control section and use this curve to adjust the values. Maybe make the darks a bit darker. And just you can control click to add new points. And this is objectively a better looking image. And now you can add a nice background image in post instead of this white background if you wish so, as the dome light won't add to the alpha. Great. When you save your render, if you want to save these photographic exposure and color correction adjustments with your render and don't plan on any color correction in post, you can have these options checked. Otherwise, disable them before starting the final render, and especially if you have AOVs. And after the render is finished and saved, do your exposure adjustments and color correction in post, and that might be better as you would keep the linearity of the render intact. Meaning, if you are planning to have a back to beauty composite using AOVs, you still get the exact same image in post after adding different AOVs together. Otherwise, it might not match exactly with the render that you see here in the render view. We talk about this stuff in depth in the rendering section of the course, but just a heads up here. While we are here, let's quickly try other approaches to interior lighting in Redshift. Before that, let's change the denoising engine to optics for a real-time denoising experience. And you can do that right in the render view as well. First, let's try a simple sun and sky rig. Before that, we can turn off our dome and infinite light. We still need to keep the portal light enabled for the same reasons previously mentioned. You just need to rotate the rig and make sure the light can shine through if you want to have any sun shining, but otherwise you can obviously rotate it in a way that the sun wouldn't enter the room. And now we can work on the photographic exposure and adjust the shutter time ratio, maybe for a longer exposure or shorter exposure depending on what you have. When using sun and sky, you have a bit more creative control compared to the previous approach. You can change the sky model, maybe offset the horizon height so the line wouldn't be visible through the window. You can change the red-blue shift or saturation, or increase the sun disk scale for softer shadows. Obviously, you can change the position of the sun in the sky to get different looks, afternoon, sunset, noon, which would be harder to do with a dome light and an infinite light. You can obviously still use HDRI images with dome lights for interior lighting. Let's disable our sun and sky rig, add a new dome light. We can rename it so we can differentiate it later on. Load this, the sky is on fire HDRI. As we are in ACES, change the color space to linear sRGB. Sometimes when working with HDRIs, IPR might have some issues with portal light, so let's turn it off while running IPR. We can turn it back on for the final render. Maybe we can rotate it for 50 degrees here and change the shutter time for a better exposure. And this gives us this moody render. We still can incorporate an infinite light with this setup as well to simulate sun. You can try that on your own. Obviously, you need to use some common sense. It doesn't have to have a sun all the time. Or we can try an HDRI that has a nice sun. Let's try this Fright Station HDRI as well to get a different look. And let's set its rotation to 0 so the sun can shine through. We can work on the photographic exposure as well to get a well-exposed render. Maybe shutter time of around 6. And this results in a completely different look. So you can try different HDRIs and each time get a completely new feel and look. Let's stop IPR. Enable our portal light, and let's go for one more render right in the render view. So here is our render. Maybe you can see that the noising has kind of softened the image a bit too much. We can obviously adjust the denoising settings to get sharper shadows, but we'll talk about denoising in the rendering section later on. We can also make it a bit moodier by adding a bit of warm color tint to our HDRI. Let's do that and take one final render again. Nice. So in this lesson, we learned about interior lighting in Redshift for Cinema 4D. See you in the next one.